Hello, so a reflection today on what may those of us who feel we are occasionally labeled our behavior or our style of presentation as disgusting by others. What might we learn by trying to understand what might be in their mindsets? And do they actually have something possibly to say that we might want to respond to actually change within ourselves? I'm absolutely hopeless at creating what's known as a theory of mind. This is a term that's used very often in the autistic world to describe the inability many autistic people have to um, imagine what other people may be thinking, and to have an appreciation that there are perspectives, an appreciation in the moment, I should say, the perspectives that are different from our own, or from their own thinking. Now, of course, a part of theory of mind is that we do not know exactly what's going on inside the mind of another person. We do not know their life histories, their backgrounds, what may be triggering them. And often we, even if we know them well, we may only very partially or vaguely know aspects of that. However, I think there are some obvious candidates when we're talking about those who might be judgmental, who point the finger and call out those of us they see as being disgusting, abominable. And it's probably worthwhile trying to get into their minds a little bit as best we can. And here I'm talking about those who are not strictly led by religious teaching, which is another consideration that we've spoken about before. Firstly, what I might call the school bully, who picks on, let's say, an effeminate boy as the object of their attack, calling them a raving puff or whatever. Then there's, let's call her the average Mrs. Smith, who thinks that men who go to bed together, for example, might be women who go to bed together as well, and get up to all sorts of unthinkable things in her mind, are simply disgusting. What might be going on inside the minds of these? I don't know, but here are a couple of possible thoughts. So first, let's turn to the school bully. I perceive here someone who picks on another boy that they see as being feminine in manner or in terms of their physicality, not just teasing them, but having real aggression, really going for them. They're very pointed in their insults and may often physically threaten or indeed actually attack the individual concerned. In my mind, they will often draw attention to what they are doing among their own peers, their own group, their own bonding, perhaps wanting to mark themselves out as someone who is macho and not themselves in any way tarnished by what they may see as perverse behavior or a perverse way of expressing dress or whatever, or manner. This actually may well be at the root of what is motivating at least some of them, a projection of something that they fear in themselves onto the other person. Whether or not this is suppressing a homosexual tendency or what they may perceive as being a deviant nature, they may well be insecure in their own sexuality and presentation as a male, and so are desperate, as it were, to be acknowledged as such, as macho, by their peers. In other words, they overplay their public display of what, in their view, it means to be a man. This is just one possibility, of course, and doubtless wouldn't apply in all cases. The group mindset that I mentioned before, the idea that in traditional societies, men were expected to fight and play their part in the group, and those who were treated like weak, those who weren't, who showed signs of weakness, as it were treated very similar to a perceived weak chicken that's rooted out, weaned out when it shows signs of a blood attack by other chickens. This may also feature, I don't know, in this mindset of what motivates some of the bullies. This might be dismissed as being nearly all about the pains of growing up and finding our place in society. So, in other words, tolerance of bullying in societies, in any species, is to be expected. Is part of, as it were, the natural order of selection. I wonder too if there's something here about character building. It's a little bit like cross-country runs in the cold and rain that probably many of us endured in our early teens, which were supposedly good for building character. And perhaps they were to a small extent, serving as a kind of rite of passage. This idea that we're being introduced to things that we will face in life, the situations that we don't necessarily want, they're not going to be comfortable and cozy and like, but we're going to have to get used to the idea that life involves confronting those from time to time. But I think that the attacks, the confrontations that bullies put up is of a different order to that. It's also of a different order, I think, to the kind of teasing that might go on, let's say, in a boys' school. I mentioned before John Lithgow's experience playing a girl's role in a scout camp show production, and the flushes of embarrassment that that drew when he was preparing for that. Actually, those that have the courage to do this have my great admiration. Arguably, they show greater self-assurance, strength of character, contentment or assurance with their own sexuality, perhaps, than many of their peers. And at least in John Lithgow's case, he not only lived to tell the tale, but was actually seemingly warmly received and kind of feted. Rather than being jeered, it was actually jeered turned to cheers by his chums for allowing himself to be ribbed and going through with the challenge, and possibly also sparing the embarrassment of others who might have had to step in that role if he hadn't. I don't know if he was volunteered or if he volunteered. So this kind of reaction among a gang seems to be of a very different order to what motivates the bully. It may simply come from an immature idea of young adolescent boys that acting like a girl or playing girls' games is taboo, weak, soft, or simply perhaps missing out on all the good things that boys do and the great games they get into. A bit like perhaps some younger, typically girls, might say that they believe that all boys smell. It won't take too many years, I don't think, for all of those, or at least the vast majority, to realize that that isn't so. So I don't take much from reflecting on the mindset of the school bully that I might be persuaded as valid criticism of my appearance or supposed orientation. I was very fortunate not to be bullied at all at school. I didn't present as being particularly effeminate, was largely in the background in most things, and possibly there were other things I could have been teased for, although generally weren't. I was a bit overweight, for example. I wasn't good at sports, and I think that was just generally accepted that I would be one of those sort of towards the back of the queue to be chosen in team sports. But there was no great debate about that, and I was okay with that. So what about the what I've called the average Mrs. Smith, for want of a better word? Perhaps someone, and this may be male or female, who is a confirmed heterosexual, has grown up with conditioning that teaches that marriage between men and women is good for raising families, and one who turns their nostrils up at the idea of any mention of someone whose sexual presentation or behavior in their mind doesn't conform to what's right and proper. I have a former elderly neighbour in mind here, going back quite some time, who was definitely of a much older generation. Way back in the early 70s, she hosted a visitor from Holland, a young gay man. Now, behind his back, she spoke very often in disapproving terms, saying that he wore lipstick, was, in her words, one of those. And while not strongly condemning him, clearly felt uncomfortable with his appearance and slightly effete manner. I suspect this had more to do with a lack of exposure to people who dress or whose walking style and mannerisms were unfamiliar to her than anything. It was a very white, English, family oriented neighborhood. Very, very few people, outsiders as it were, people who were different, were seen in that neighborhood very often. It was well before the age of the internet, of course, and also when LGBTQ people were well represented on TV. So to see someone like this Dutch chap was really quite a rarity for her. Maybe she projected her own ideas about what sexual acts he might get up to in private and felt disturbed by these since they didn't fit with her own idea of what was natural. I don't know. Perhaps she associated his dress and mannerisms too much with what she may have thought was going on in the bedroom, something that perhaps she might not normally feature in her thinking when chatting with her neighbour across the wall, for example. The kind of disapproval this might prompt might not be very different from the disinterest some of us have in the private lives of others, and simply being confronted by mention of that, or certainly imagery or explicit descriptions, is something that we err against. We just simply do not want to know. People's private lives are their private lives. Whatever, there was a judgment being made about the Dutchman, and one based on personal experience that for that particular neighbour was what she saw as right behaviour, and what those around her, in other words, the society she was in at the time, expected. And I wonder if the young man had spent more than a couple of weeks with her. I think it was on some kind of language exchange program, and she was a host family. If she'd really got to know him as a person, whether things would have changed, and all of this judgment, this initial shock around dress would have just faded into the background, and she would have come to know him as hopefully a fairly, in her view, normal person, or at least a likable person. I don't know him, but I'm making an assumption there that beyond his behavior and presentation, there was, so perhaps with increased exposure, shock, what may shock us, what may shock the Mrs. Smith, will cease to be. That's what I'd like to believe, at least. And I think would be normal for most people. In other words, when we get to know a person, rather than being distracted by initial shock and judgments of their appearance, that we should be able to come to accept them fully and enjoy their company no less than with any other person. So, can I take anything from this little rambling? If I'm one like the Dutch visitor whose expression or perceived sexual behavior in private doesn't fit with what someone initially approves of or expects, should I take that judgment as having any sort of authority? I think the answer for me is very clearly no. But perhaps I can be understanding of why some people, at least, may react the way they do by trying to understand possibly what's going on in their mindset, the mindset, as it were, in this case, of the average Mrs. Smith. There are likely many other perspectives that I've not understood or recognized that may play into all of this. However, I at least feel that while I respect and try to understand the judgments of others, including being open to being shown something that I may need to change, or which may really point out something dislikable in me. When I see the likely motivations for those judgments, common though they may be, they do not convict me to say that who I am and how I present is wrong. This little exercise in theory of mind is useful, I think, for me, because it helps confirm what I feel I know. I'm okay with being who I am.